Welcome to our first in the series of our Intelex and COMET focus sessions, where we will discuss some big ideas and deliver clear takeaways, all in about 20 minutes. Today's session is all about good investigations and what they should look like. I mean, there's a bunch to unpack here, but I am excited to at least get down into a couple of those areas more granularly. So, to briefly introduce ourselves, my name is Scott Gaddis. I'm the Vice President of Safety and Health at Intelex Technologies. And Craig, there's no time to dig into a lot of our background, but you introduce yourself.
Great to meet everyone. Hopefully everyone listening in will get a lot of benefit from our chat today. For your benefit, my name's Craig Smith. I'm Head of Operations at COMET. We're investigation root cause analysis specialists. So yeah, hopefully some good insights today in Scott. I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So let's go ahead and just kick it off. When you look back at how organizations typically respond to a workplace incident, what's the most common mistake you see in those first critical hours or days of this investigation process?
Well, it's a perfect way to kick it off, Scott, I think, because investigations, and certainly in our experience, are often dictated in the quality from what happens at the beginning, not at the end. But I think conversely to that, people and investigators and maybe those in receipt of investigation outcomes are very keen to know, not just what happened, but why it happened. That kind of golden period of that kind of 12 to sort of 24 hours is so crucial to the outcome. So my advice typically would be, from what I've seen in the past, is let's not rush to the finish line. The better we do at the beginning, and if we're prepared, we're going to get the right outcomes. So let's be prepared, don't rush, and you'll get much more valuable, to your point, learning out of that than just doing it for the sake of doing it, right? So I think it's about being prepared.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that, I'm a practitioner, right? I've been doing this for 36 years, and I've had to learn, through segments of my time, because I can remember early on, the biggest mistake that I was making, I was rushing to the scene, right? I was trying to get a name, actually before even understanding the work, because I just wanted to close the loop. I just wanted to get this investigation done, and treating an investigation like a compliance exercise versus, this thing we now call the learning event. So there is a phrase, that gets used a lot in investigations: human error, right? And before we dig into a lot of this in depth, how would you describe why that label is so appealing to organizations, even when I think it probably tells us very little about what's happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's, I don't think we could possibly have a discussion about investigations and root cause analysis without talking about human error. I think the first thing that we have to accept is actually human error is normal. And whilst we're on a journey, to try and be much more resilient to human error, and looking at error traps and conditions and why these errors are allowed to happen, we have to accept that more often than not, that is actually far beyond the human. And so I think why it's so appealing, first of all, to answer the question, is because it's an easy outcome. It's much easier to fix the worker than it is to fix the work, so to speak. Whilst you might get some shorter term solutions to that, what it doesn't, of course, get to us really in terms of understanding is the why. So whilst we can talk about human error more from a perspective of what happened, which is normal, it doesn't tell us why it happened. So why is that important in your experience then? Why is it important that we don't just understand the facts and what happened, but actually getting to that why? And what's the difference from what to the why in an investigation, do you think?
Yeah, I mentioned I've been doing this quite a long time, and one thing that I noticed is that the what is the timeline, right? It's useful, but it's just the surface of what I really need to understand. And I think as I look at it now, the why is where the real work actually starts. In practice, I think the shift happens when you stop asking, what did this person do? And start asking, what conditions made that action make sense to them in that moment? And just simply doing some of those mental exercises that you can verbalize during an investigation changes the information that you'll receive. I think really a lot of it because of, this term now we use as psychological safety. Somebody feels they can be more honest, about this process. So I tend to use a very simple gut check. If your findings could apply to an incident anywhere, you really haven't found the why yet, right? You've found a placeholder. And that really is what I've come to understand about good investigation and understanding the why is that where else could this happen at? Is this bigger than this just one event? And that moves me very, very quickly past the what in the timeline. So the why for me lives between that gap between work as I imagine it to be done, and I've written plenty of SOPs and job safety analysis in my time, lining out what the work is as I imagined it. There's a gap between that and then work is done. And the timeline tells you what happened. Closing that gap tells you why it happened. So that's what I would say is that it's really, really important to understand what why really looks like in your investigation process.
Yeah.
So, I think about that and we're going very quickly through these, right? Is that, as I kind of frame it that way, human factors it is a term that means different things to different people. And if I had 20 different safety colleagues in here, they would define it a bit different, from one another. But for someone who is listening, who maybe hasn't come across it before, how do you explain what it is and why it matters so much in incident investigation?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a natural extension from when we just spoke a little bit earlier about human error, right? In fact, the human factor or the human factors typically is what allowed a human error to exist. So if you think about that logically, again, you have to be thinking about the circumstances, the conditions, the influences that have allowed that error to occur, right? Now, so what that really means is actually human factors is not just about the human, okay? It's not just about that human error.
Yeah.
It's about all of those organizational factors around culture and leadership and influence. It's about the actual work and the job and the task being done, like to your point there, work how we expect it to be done, how we imagine it to be done versus what's actually being done. That has to be explored. And the people themselves, okay? So not just from a competence point of view, a technical competence point of view, we're all able and willing to get up and do our jobs competently each and every day. But there are so many conditions and factors that can influence how we think about things, how we approach things, that really can have an impact on how we do work that day. So really, human factors is about looking far beyond the human. And it's about understanding we've had an error. We can't change that now. What were the factors and the reasons that allowed the condition that led to that error? And the more honest we are with ourselves as an organization in an investigation, particularly as a learning organization, much better chance we have of recognizing these issues and hopefully eliminating them from happening in the future. It's a bit like the substitution test. If the chances are that somebody else with similar experiences, similar competence in that same situation, same position, would likely have made the same decision, then that's not that person's fault, right? There's a systemic issue that sits behind that.
Yep.
We can dive into that, of course, but that hopefully provides a little bit of explanation about what human factors is. It's way beyond the human.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that, and I go all the way back, and I was doing an interview yesterday with another trade magazine, and they were asking me about some of the the previous authors, right, that I really read, and I go all the way back to a guy named Dan Peterson. In the 1970s, right, he was talking about safety in the framework is that people and the system that that person is actually working in are two big areas that you really need to understand if you want better control. And I think of many writers, even Cindy Decker, right, he talked about that, is that it's a person working within the system that produces this output. And I think that's what you said, Craig, is that there's a lot to this. I think we tend to go back to quote this person because we've named this or labeled this a human factor, right? But there's a lot inside of that piece of the puzzle that we need to understand. So when you do look past the individual who has been involved in this incident that we're investigating, what do you typically find? What kinds of organizational or systemic conditions tend to just really show up repeatedly?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't want to be so vague as just to say, well, every single, root cause outcome has to come back and be an organizational factor, right, or a system factor. Yeah, there's a strong chance that it will. But again, I think it's about recognizing that it's about intentionality when it comes to how people do things. And if people typically as acting as last line of defense at that point in time where, really critical, situational awareness can sometimes be the difference between safety and an incident happening or avoiding one. So we do rely heavily upon the human being. So when we have these errors and these lapses, and we look behind that, we have to look at all of those circumstances, as I've said, that allowed that to be the case. And I think in our experience, the intention of the human is more often than not good. Okay, there may be an awareness that there's been a
Hmm.
shortcut taking or a rule bending, but if that's become normalized, then we have to accept that the intention was actually right. So again, quite often it will take us back into the effectiveness of management systems, the effectiveness of our control of work, and the effectiveness of how we actually, are engaging with the workforce on a kind of daily basis. All of these things, consciously and subconsciously, can make a difference to how humans operate. So yeah, I wouldn't be so vague as to say it's all about, the system or the organization or management that sit behind that. But all of these things are so very relatable to how human beings operate on a day to day, and we have to factor that in. And actually, again, that makes me think of, we've quite often kind of coined this sort of phrase in an investigation, which is looking at the sharp end versus the blunt end. Okay, and people listening might be thinking, well, what do we mean by that? Well, if we think about the sharp end, as I've just described, that's the worker in the work, in the line of fire, doing the real work, right? The dangerous work. But then you've got the blunt end, which is all of the management and the leadership and the design and the policy that sits behind that. How can we, as an organization, if we're listening into this and want to really learn from it, how can we look honestly, not just at the coal-face sharp end, but the kind of blunt end, contributions, and say, well, how do we do better? That's an uncomfortable place to be, right? Because we're
Yeah.
probably looking at management
Yeah.
a little bit. So how do we get better at that?
Yeah, and I think it's just right. It's a nice segue from what you just said with the last question, is that you do automatically have to look past this individual. And when you do that, you find these fingerprints, right, all through the organization. You find production pressure, you find normalized deviation, you find gaps between a procedure and what the practice is. You find supervisors, right, acting in a way that is contrary to what you thought that they should be working in. So when I think about the blunt end, I think the blunt end of an investigation process has always got to be willing to investigate itself with the same rigor that it investigates the worker. And
Mm.
that's different because I think we tend to focus on where the largest output in this investigation process is. And it's usually this final decision, right, that a worker has made that jeopardizes his or her safety or even process laws in an organization. I think that's the test of where your culture is actually real or is very performative. And what I try to do is I try to help organizations get there by reframing questions. Now, it's not that simple, but I think it's a good start in the 20 minutes that we have. Instead of asking what did the worker do wrong, I ask what decisions made upstream, months or years that set up this condition for this moment to happen. Was it a budget decision? Was it a staffing decision? Was the procedure, designed correct? So I think the discomfort is the point. If the blunt end findings don't make us as senior leaders kind of squirm a little bit, I don't even think the investigation went deep enough. I think we really have to go to that level of understanding. And when I talk about this, I really kind of talk about it in a way. Did we design right these errors into the system? Did we activate them somehow? The output is that last section. So I tell leaders quite often is that the worker had seconds to make this decision many times. We've had years, right? And that usually lands when I'm trying to kind of figure out, what is the difference between this blunt end and the sharp end, and this idea of pulling this all together into a little bit, more narrower stream of understanding. So yeah, so that's kind of how I think about it. What about you, Craig?
That resonated with me. So that's really, really useful. But I think what you've touched on there, or certainly a few things you've touched on, takes us back to looking at the work and the planning and how thorough the investigation actually goes. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about proportionality and scalability and things as well. But if we look at an investigation honestly, there has to be a level of thoroughness, right, that we have to look at. There has to be a
There
level
is.
of expectation, and maybe that comes from the experience and the competence of those involved, of course. But again, in your experience, then, if you are QCing or you're reviewing an investigation, what are you looking for? What are the sort of strengths and the strong points within that you're looking for, and what might concern you if certain things were missing? What would be a red flag in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question because I noticed I even changed myself as I went from a plant level to a corporate level, and I've seen hundreds of investigations of everything from near misses that we needed to understand all the way up to very severe things. I always look at language first. If a report uses passive voice and abstract nouns, a failure occurred, communication broke down, somebody was protecting somebody. Good reports name the system conditions plainly. So I do understand when I've seen fractures within our work system, I look at the corrective actions. If they've all been aimed at a worker, retrain, rewrite, add a sign, that's a very surface level, investigation. And a thorough one drives changes upstream into design and to supervision, to the management systems. I think I've always separated it between immediate cause and root cause. And I share this quite often in interviews is that, understanding why that guard was taken off is different than understanding that I need to put the guard back on. So, when I kind of start thinking about this, I want to see those things in the investigation flow. I look for evidence of curiosity. Did the investigators talk to the people who do the work every day, not just the one that was involved in this event?
Yeah.
Years ago, we called those people, right, bystanders or watchers, right? But we didn't ask them. We just worked around them. So did we really ask those people about workarounds, about time pressure, about what normal actually looked like when this event happened? And then I tend to look for what's missing, right? No report with no uncomfortable findings about the organization itself is often, for me, an incomplete report. I do want to squirm in my chair a little bit, and many times I've had to ask those questions of myself. Did I go far enough to understand this? And it's a big difference in how we investigate things, I believe. So when I've said that, tell us why having a scalable, we talked about a lot of things here, but a scalable and a proportionate investigation
Mm.
approach can really serve an organization. And of course, it takes time, right? So shouldn't all investigations just be deep and thorough as we talked about them?
No, it's the short answer. And again, some people listening, watching might think, well, that's clearly wrong, Craig. But actually, it isn't. I think organizations who are maturing in this investigation space and are learning from it have to accept that not every single incident or event does merit a cross-functional team of 5 people working on something for 2 or 3 weeks. That's just not realistic. Now, some events, maybe your
Yeah.
top 10%, of course, you're going to need that, right? And of course, we can look at incident types and reporting and regulatory scrutiny. There will require that sort of deeper dive investigation. But a lot of events, maybe even 80, 90% of cases that occur that require some form of investigation, need to just be proportionate, right? That might be 1 or 2 people for 1 or 2 hours. So we're talking about a big differential there between the different takes. The problem is if you have an organization that have a one approach fits all type of mentality, that
Yeah.
you might encourage underreporting. If people think, gosh, this was a fairly minor event, it was a near miss, there was a little bit of potential, but it was reasonably under control, but we've got to report it. But that's going to lead to management on site and all kinds of eyes on us. We don't need that hassle, right? That can lead to underreporting, and that's a big risk. So having a proportionate and a fair, balanced way of investigating those lower level events, where you can still learn from them, you can still share the outputs, you can still gather why it's happened and correlate, okay, could that have led to something more serious? And you can still use that information intelligently, but you have to be proportionate in how you deal with it. And actually, as I've said, 80, 90% of the time, that will be fit for purpose.
Yeah.
And so maturing in this space is not about learning how to do everything as a deep dive, but actually it's about learning how to do it proportionately and in a fair response to the incident. Now, some people might feel uncomfortable about that, but that is the reality of today. And when we go out and coach and work with organizations, for us, it's all about scalability, Scott. And actually, what that leads us on to a little bit is talking about culture, right? And culture change in organizations and looking at investigations and how we go about it. So again, I wouldn't mind just getting your perspective on that a little bit. And I'm going to circle back a bit to the kind of human error piece that we spoke about at the top of our discussion. If we're going to mature in that space and we're going to move away, if you're putting yourself in the shoes as a safety leader, a safety manager, how do you mature away from the change that if human error is not a root cause, that gives us a challenge to think about because it's not an easy outcome. And it's not just a technical thing, it's maybe a culture thing. What advice do you have for somebody listening in that's on that journey?
Yeah, I could talk about this for the next couple of hours. I think very quickly, I think just ask yourself, how do you start or how do you respond after the next near miss, right? Culture isn't about what you say in a town hall, it's what you do in the first 10 minutes after something goes wrong. And it actually goes all the way back. I mean, I'm not waiting for a severe thing to happen in my workplace. I'm looking at the near miss because the output could have been the same. That's a culture lever, right? I think the shift begins with leadership language. Stop asking who and start asking what. What made
Yeah.
this make sense to the organization? And then I would close it off by this. I would say that to be very, very patient, culture is a journey, that has a destination that's ahead of you. So many times this is a multi-year shift. You're rewiring how organizations think about people and about the work that they're doing, and they're watching you. So the first signal that it's working isn't fewer incidents, it's better conversations about those incidents and how they occurred and how we actually mitigate or eliminate them. So this culture journey, I think it's leveraged by how we actually talk about things that go bad in the workplace. And I think, as we're kind of running out of time here, if I could ask you, Craig, to give one piece of advice to someone who is about to lead their first serious incident investigation,
Yeah.
something that you wish somebody had told you, what would that be?
Wow. Not don't worry. Don't worry about it. It's a daunting challenge, and sometimes we put ourselves in that shoes and that responsibility, and we want to get everything right. Investigations are challenging. You won't always get all the answers and all the findings. Rely on the people around you. Use the expertise that's there, and do the best you can. Sometimes starting off on an investigator journey is about just getting started, not worrying about the end game. So don't worry. Use the people around you, and it won't be perfect, and it doesn't need to be.
That is fantastic. I think what I took from that, Craig, is that listen more than you talk, right? Listen more than you
There
talk,
you go. Right
especially
on.
in those first conversations. The people
Sure, sure.
closest to the work already know most than what you will know and what you need to find. So your job,
Sure.
I think it's my job, is to make it safe for them to tell you. And maybe one more thing as we end. Remember that someone's going to read your report, someone's going to look at your report, somebody's going to try to understand your report, and they're either going to learn something that protects the next worker or they're not. So write it for them, not just for a file. And that's what I always want to do with my own, investigation reporting. Well, Craig, I know we're out of time. It's been a pleasure having you today. I know we're going to be doing many of these going forward. So if you are listening to us, these only get more granular as we go forward, and we're going to talk about different topics to make sure that you're doing the very best investigation and making sure that we actually get our people home safe and healthy every single day after their shift. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.